The smell of burnt metal still clung to Daniel's gloves when he walked into the medical bay. His right forearm throbbed where a loose panel had caught him during the coolant repair job, and he figured a quick scan would settle the matter before his shift ended. He had no idea that the next few minutes would turn the entire ship upside down. The medical bay of the Meridian Drift was quiet at this hour, lit by a soft blue glow from the diagnostic screens. Dr. Ilven stood near the scanning table, adjusting a set of instruments that looked more like tuning forks than anything a human doctor would use. He was Solari, tall and thin, with skin the color of wet slate and eyes that shifted between amber and gray depending on his mood. This was his first full rotation treating a human patient, and he had studied human anatomy charts for weeks in preparation. Still, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to see. "Sit here, please," Ilven said, motioning to the table. His voice carried the careful, clipped tone of someone speaking a second language with great effort. "This will only take a moment." Daniel climbed onto the table and rolled up his sleeve without thinking twice. He had done this 100 times back on Earth. A scan, a bandage, maybe a joke about how he needed to be more careful with loose panels, and then back to work. He rested his arm on the scanning pad and looked around the room, mildly curious about the strange equipment lining the walls. Ilven ran the scanner over Daniel's forearm, and the readout screen lit up with a wave of color. At first, it looked like a normal injury. Then the deeper scan kicked in, the one that mapped tissue layers beneath the skin, and Ilven's amber eyes went wide. There, embedded under Daniel's skin, was a dense, dark pattern. Lines curled and branched in complex shapes, some circular, some jagged, and one long shape near his elbow that looked like a chain. To a Solari physician, there was only one explanation for foreign material lodged permanently under living tissue, a spreading infection that had darkened and calcified over time. "Do not move," Ilven said, his voice suddenly sharp. Daniel blinked. "What? Why?" "There is a growth beneath your skin. It has spread across a significant portion of your arm." Ilven's hands hovered over the console, his composure cracking at the edges. "How long have you had this? Why did you not report it sooner?" Daniel looked down at his arm, genuinely confused for a second before understanding dawned on him. He almost laughed, but the look on Ilven's face stopped him. The doctor was not joking. He was afraid. "Doc, that's just it." "I need to isolate you immediately," Ilven interrupted, already tapping commands into the console. "This pattern suggests active spread. If it has reached this density, there may be systemic involvement. I cannot allow you to leave this room." Before Daniel could finish his sentence, a soft chime rang out, followed by the hiss of a containment field rising around the medical bay's central pod. Daniel found himself stepping back instinctively as a curved wall of pale light rose from the floor, sealing him inside a section of the room. "Doctor, seriously, hold on." Ilven was already at the comm panel, pressing his palm against it. "This is Dr. Ilven in the medical bay. I am declaring a Level 2 biological containment. I need Captain Bellum and First Officer Vaughn here immediately." The words landed heavy in Daniel's chest. Level 2 containment was not something the crew joked about. He had sat through the safety briefings same as everyone else. Level 2 meant something was wrong enough to threaten the whole ship, not just one person. Within moments, the medical bay doors slid open, and Captain Orsa Bellum strode in, her expression already tight with concern. She was a broad-shouldered woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid, someone who had commanded joint human-alien crews long enough to expect the unexpected. Right behind her came First Officer Talais Vaughn, tall and sharp-featured, moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who took protocol very seriously. "Report," Bellum said, eyes scanning the containment field and landing on Daniel, who stood inside it looking more annoyed than afraid. The human presence with an extensive subdermal growth on his right forearm, Ilven said quickly, pulling up the scan image on the main screen. Dark branching shapes filled the display, magnified many times over. The pattern suggests long-term, possibly aggressive infection. I have never seen tissue discoloration of this scale in a living patient. Talais Vaughn stepped closer to the screen, studying the image with a frown. How long has this been developing? I don't know, Ilven admitted. He has not mentioned any prior treatment. All eyes turned to Daniel, standing inside the glowing containment pod with his arms crossed and his sleeves still rolled up. He let out a slow breath, realizing that explaining this properly was going to take more than a few words. Look, he said, keeping his voice calm and even, before anyone starts cutting anything off my arm, I think you should all hear what I have to say. Because that thing on my screen isn't a disease. It's not spreading. It's not going to kill me. Bellum raised an eyebrow. Then what is it? Daniel looked down at the dark pattern under his skin, the anchor and chain design he had carried for almost 10 years, and allowed himself a small, tired smile. It's a choice, he said, one my whole species has been making for thousands of years. The room fell silent, the containment field humming softly around him, as three sets of very different eyes waited for him to explain something that to him had always been simple. Word of the containment order spread through the meridian drift faster than anyone expected. By the time Reeve Nolan heard about it, half the engineering deck was already whispering theories about what kind of alien parasite had gotten into Daniel during the coolant repair. Reeve dropped his tools the moment he heard his friend's name mentioned over the comm channel and sprinted toward the medical bay, nearly knocking over a cart of spare parts on the way. He arrived to find the corridor outside medical crowded with crew members, both human and Solari, watching through the reinforced glass as Daniel stood inside a shimmering containment field with his arms still exposed. Captain Bellum and First Officer Vaughn stood nearby, deep in a tense discussion with Dr. Ilven, who kept glancing back at the scan results as if hoping they might change. What is going on? Reeve asked, pushing through the small crowd until a security officer held out an arm to stop him. Quarantine protocol, the officer said. Nobody goes in or out until the medical team clears it. Quarantine for what? That's my friend in there. Inside the containment field, Daniel caught sight of Reeve through the glass and gave him a small, exasperated wave, the kind that said this is ridiculous rather than help me. Reeve's shoulders relaxed slightly at the gesture, but the knot in his stomach did not fully loosen. Dr. Ilven turned back to the group, his composure regained, but his voice still carrying an edge of urgency. The subdermal pattern shows no signs of biological activity consistent with any pathogen in our records. However, that does not mean it is safe. It could be something entirely unknown to Solari medicine, something our systems are not equipped to detect. Talais Vaughn crossed his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on the screen. Unknown pathogens are exactly why containment protocol exists. We cannot take chances with something that could spread to the rest of the crew, human or Solari. With respect, Bellum said, keeping her voice level, I've served with humans for over a decade. I have never seen anything like this reported as dangerous. Then perhaps you have simply never encountered it before, Vaughn replied. Humanity is still relatively new to interspecies medical exchange. There may be conditions your own doctors have never properly studied. Reeve, still standing outside the containment area, could not hold his tongue any longer. Okay, hold on. Can someone just ask him what it actually is before we start talking about unknown space diseases? Because I think I already know the answer, and it's going to be a little embarrassing for everyone. Ilven turned toward him, confused. You are familiar with this condition. It's not a condition, Reeve said, half laughing despite the tension in the room. It's a tattoo, it's ink. He got it done at a shop back on Earth years ago. It's not going to hurt anybody. The Solari crew members standing near the glass exchanged uncertain glances. The word tattoo meant nothing to them. Ilven repeated it slowly, as if testing the shape of it in his mouth, then shook his head. I am not familiar with this term. If it is a form of medical treatment, I need to understand its function immediately. It's not medical, Reeve said, throwing up his hands. It's decoration. People choose to have ink placed under their skin to make a picture or a symbol. It's permanent. That's kind of the point. The silence that followed was heavy enough that even Daniel, still standing inside the containment field, could feel it through the glass. Ilven's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to alarm. "You are telling me that humans voluntarily introduce foreign material into their own bodies," he said slowly, "for the purpose of decoration." "Basically, yeah." Ilven turned back to his console, his hands moving quickly now. "That does not reduce the danger. Foreign material embedded in tissue, regardless of intent, carries risk of infection, immune reaction, or long-term degradation. If this practice is common among humans, then perhaps it explains cases we have not yet properly documented. I must proceed with removal before complications worsen." "Removal?" Daniel's voice cut through the glass, sharp and alarmed. "Doc, you don't need to remove anything. It's just skin. It's not hurting me." But Ilven was already moving, pulling a slim surgical drone from its charging dock along the wall. The device hovered to life with a low hum, its small manipulator arms unfolding one by one, each tipped with a fine cutting edge. Bellum's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen. "Doctor, wait," she said, stepping forward. "Let's slow down here. Captain, if this material is spreading beneath his skin, every moment of delay increases the risk," Ilven said, getting the drone toward the containment field's access port. "I have a responsibility to this patient's safety." Daniel backed away from the edge of the pod, his heart picking up speed despite his attempt to stay calm. He had faced plenty of dangerous situations during his years working ship repairs, but none of them involved a well-meaning alien doctor trying to cut a chunk out of his arm because of a decade-old tattoo of an anchor and chain. "Dr. Ilven," Daniel said, forcing his voice to stay steady even as the drone's small red activation light blinked on, "before you do anything with that thing, give me 60 seconds. That's all I'm asking. 60 seconds, and I promise this will make sense." Ilven paused, his hand hovering over the control panel, torn between medical urgency and the very real uncertainty on the human's face. The drone hovered near the containment field's edge, waiting for a command that had not yet been given. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. 60 seconds was not a lot of time to explain 10,000 years of human history, but Daniel figured he would do his best. The surgical drone hovered near the edge of the containment field, its small light blinking a patient red, waiting for a command that could still go either way. "Dr. Ilven," Daniel said, keeping his hands raised slightly, palms open, the universal sign for "I am not a threat" that seemed to translate across most species he had met. "That pattern under my skin isn't an infection, it's ink-colored pigment. It was put there on purpose by a person with a needle a long time ago. I asked for it. I paid for it. I chose it." Ilven's hand stayed near the console, but he did not give the final command. Why would anyone choose to have foreign material placed permanently into their own tissue? What possible benefit could outweigh the risk? "For us, it's not really about risk and benefit the way you're thinking," Daniel said. "It's about meaning. Humans have been doing this for a very long time, Doctor. Long before we had spaceships, long before we understood infection or medicine the way we do now, people were marking their skin with ink. Some of the oldest human bodies ever found, preserved in ice for thousands of years, still had tattoos on them when they were discovered." Talais Van, still standing near the console, folded his arms. "For what purpose? Warning markings, rank identification." "Sometimes," Daniel said, "sailors used to get tattoos to mark how far they had traveled or what oceans they had crossed. Soldiers got them to remember battles or lost friends. Some people get them for religious reasons, some for family, some just because they like how it looks. There isn't one single reason. That's kind of the point. It's personal." Captain Bellum, watching the exchange closely, gave a small nod. "It's true. Half my old crew back on Earth had ink somewhere on their bodies. It's about as dangerous as getting your ears pierced if it's done properly." Ilven's amber eyes flicked between the humans, clearly processing information that did not fit neatly into any category his training had prepared him for. "You are saying this is done for emotional or cultural reasons, not medical, not practical." "Exactly," Daniel said. "This one," he added, glancing down at the anchor and chain pattern on his forearm, is for my grandfather. He spent 30 years working merchant ships before he passed. I got this not long after he died. It reminds me of him every time I look at it. That's not a disease, doctor. That's a memory I chose to carry with me." The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Less like fear, more like understanding trying to take root. Ilven stared at the scan image still glowing on the main screen, the dark branching lines that had looked so alarming just minutes earlier. Now, knowing what they represented, he studied them with a different kind of focus. "The pattern is intricate," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Deliberate, not random tissue damage at all. It is designed." "Yeah," Daniel said, allowing himself a small smile now that the drone's light had finally blinked off. "Someone spent hours drawing it before it ever touched my skin. There's a whole art to it. Different styles, different techniques, going back generations." Bellum stepped closer to the containment field's edge, giving Ilven a firm but understanding look. "Doctor, I should have caught this sooner. I know Solari physiology doesn't really allow for anything like this, so there was no way for you to expect it. But I can vouch for what he's telling you. Humans have entire cultures built around this practice. It is not dangerous." Ilven lowered his hand fully away from the console, and with a quiet command, guided the surgical drone back to its charging dock along the wall. The small device folded its arms and powered down, its red light fading to black. A visible tension left his shoulders as he turned back toward the containment field. "I nearly performed an unnecessary procedure," he said, his voice quieter now, almost embarrassed, "based on a complete misunderstanding of your biology and your customs." "You didn't know," Daniel said. "How could you? This is probably the first time your species has ever run into something like this. I don't blame you for being cautious. If anything, I'd rather have a doctor who takes something seriously than one who ignores a real problem." Talais Varn, who had spent most of the conversation with a skeptical frown, finally spoke again, though his tone had softened considerably. "It is an unusual custom, but I admit the idea of permanently carrying a memory on one's own body is not without its logic. Our people record histories in stone monuments and archives. Perhaps this is not so different, only smaller, and carried with you." Ilven reached for the console one final time, this time to release the containment field rather than activate the drone. The shimmering wall of light around Daniel dissolved with a soft chime, and for the first time in nearly 20 minutes, Daniel stepped freely out of the pod, rolling his sleeve back down over the tattoo that had almost cost him a chunk of his arm. "Doctor," he said, extending his hand toward Ilven in the human gesture of goodwill, "no hard feelings. Honestly, this might be the most interesting first day you've had treating a human." Ilven hesitated only a moment before understanding the gesture and carefully shaking Daniel's hand, still visibly fascinated by everything he had just learned. "I believe," Ilven said slowly, "I have a great deal more to learn about your species than my training prepared me for." Behind them, the crowd outside the medical bay, having watched the entire tense exchange through the glass, began to relax and disperse, though more than a few curious eyes lingered, already whispering about what they had just witnessed. By the next morning, the story of the human whose tattoo nearly got surgically removed had traveled through every deck of the Meridian Drift. Daniel could not walk past the mess hall without someone glancing at his forearm, and by midday, he had lost count of how many crew members, mostly Solari, had politely asked if they could see the pattern up close. He was sitting at a corner table, finishing a late breakfast, when a young Solari technician named Vesa approached, holding her tray awkwardly, clearly working up the courage to speak. "I hope I am not intruding," she said, "but I heard about what happened yesterday. May I see it? The marking, I mean." Daniel, used to this kind of curiosity by now, rolled up his sleeve without hesitation and held his arm out. Vesa leaned in, studying the anchor and chain pattern with wide, careful eyes, the same way someone might study a piece of art in a museum. "It is beautiful," she said after a moment. "The lines are so precise, and you say this was placed by hand, not by machine." "A machine, technically," Daniel said, "a small one with a needle that moves very fast, but a person guides it, an artist. An artist, Vesa repeated, testing the word. So this is not simply a marking, it is a piece of art that you carry with you forever. That's a good way to put it, Daniel said, smiling. Word of the exchange spread quickly, and by the afternoon, a small crowd had gathered near the observation deck where Daniel and Reeve were taking a break between shifts. Reeve, never one to miss an opportunity for humor, stood on a bench and addressed the growing group of curious Solari crew members with mock seriousness. All right, one at a time, he said, waving his hands. Yes, it's real ink. No, it doesn't hurt after it heals. No, we don't just tattoo random garbage on ourselves, there's usually a reason. And no, I will not show you mine, because it's a very embarrassing picture of a chicken I got when I was 19 and made some poor decisions. Laughter rippled through the crowd, human and Solari alike, though the aliens' version of laughter came out as a low, rhythmic clicking sound that Daniel had grown used to over the months aboard the ship. Even Talais Vaughn, who happened to be passing by the observation deck, paused to listen, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A chicken, Vaughn repeated flatly. This is the kind of memory your species chooses to carry permanently. Hey, in my defense, I was young and I lost a bet, Reeve said, grinning. Daniel shook his head, laughing along with the rest of the group, but as the conversation continued, he found himself sharing more than he expected. He told them about his grandfather, a merchant sailor who had spent decades hauling cargo across dangerous ocean routes before retiring to a small coastal town. He described how his grandfather used to tell him stories about storms and long nights at sea, and how the old man's own arms had been covered in faded tattoos from ports all over the world. When he passed, I didn't really know how to hold on to that, Daniel said, his voice quieter now. So I got this, the anchor for steadiness, the way he always talked about staying steady even when the sea got rough. The chain, because he used to say family was the one thing that kept a person from drifting too far. It's not just decoration, it's him. Every time I look at my arm, I think of him. Vesa, still standing nearby, tilted her head thoughtfully. Among my people, we preserve memory through carved records kept in family archives. Stone, mostly, or crystal lattice for those who can afford it. It is permanent but distant, kept in a vault, visited on occasion. And this, Talais Vaughn added slowly, glancing at Daniel's arm, is permanent but close, always present, never distant. Yeah, Daniel said, I guess that's the difference. You carry your history in a place, we carry ours on our skin. The observation deck fell into a thoughtful quiet for a moment, the kind that came after something genuinely surprising had settled into place. Reeve, sensing the mood shifting toward the sentimental, clapped his hands together loudly enough to startle a few nearby crew members. All right, that's enough emotional space talk for one afternoon, he said. Who wants to hear about the time Daniel nearly got a tattoo of a space whale because he lost a card game? That did not happen, Daniel said quickly, though the mischievous grin on Reeve's face suggested otherwise. As the group broke into more laughter, Daniel noticed Dr. Ilvin standing near the edge of the observation deck, having apparently arrived sometime during the conversation. The doctor had not said much, simply listening from a distance, his expression unreadable in the way Solari expressions often were to human eyes. When their gazes met, Ilvin gave a small nod and approached. Might I have a word with you later? Ilvin asked. In private, I have questions about this practice, about what it means to your people. Daniel, still smiling from the earlier laughter, nodded easily. Sure, Doc, anytime, come find me after my shift. Ilvin nodded once more, then turned and walked back toward the medical bay, leaving Daniel mildly curious about what exactly the doctor wanted to know. He had assumed the conversation about his tattoo had ended the moment the containment field came down. He was starting to suspect it had only just begun. The medical bay looked different at night, with most of the harsh overhead lighting dimmed and only the soft glow of monitoring screens casting shadows across the room. Daniel found Dr. Ilvin sitting at a small desk near the back, reviewing what looked like old records on a data screen, his posture more relaxed than Daniel had seen it before. You wanted to talk, Daniel said, knocking lightly on the open doorway. Ilven looked up and gestured toward a chair across from the desk. Yes, thank you for coming. Please sit. Daniel settled into the chair, glancing around the quiet room. So, what's on your mind, Doc? Ilven was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I have spent the last day reflecting on what happened yesterday, on how quickly I moved toward removal without pausing to ask questions first. It troubles me. You were doing your job, Daniel said. You saw something you'd never seen before, and it looked dangerous. That's not a failure, that's caution. Perhaps, Ilven said, but my training taught me that any anomaly in tissue represents a threat to be eliminated. Among my people, this has served us well for many generations. Our medicine is built on precision, on eliminating risk before it can grow. It has kept our species healthy for a very long time. That sounds like a good system, Daniel said. It is, Ilven agreed, but it also nearly cost you a piece of your arm and the memory you carry with it. If Reeve had not spoken up when he did, I would have proceeded with removal before you had the chance to explain. Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering this. I don't think that makes your system bad, Doctor. It just means it wasn't built with something like this in mind. No system accounts for everything. That's true of ours too. We've made plenty of mistakes assuming things about other species just because we didn't understand them yet. Ilven nodded slowly, though something still seemed to weigh on him. I would like to understand it better, not simply as information in a medical file, but truly understand what it means to choose something permanent for reasons that are not practical. Our people do not do this. We honor memory through preserved records, through monuments, through archives kept safe and separate from the body. The idea of carrying it physically always present is, he paused, searching for the word, foreign. But not unwelcome. You want to understand it, Daniel said slowly, an idea beginning to form, or you want to experience it. Ilven's amber eyes flicked up, meeting Daniel's gaze directly. Is that even possible? Solari skin is different from human skin, our tissue composition, our healing processes. I'm not a doctor, Daniel said, but I've picked up a lot from being around ink for years, and I know a bit about tattoo technique from a hobby I used to have back home. If your skin can hold pigment safely, and your body doesn't reject foreign material the way it seemed to think mine did, then in theory, yeah, it's possible. Ilven sat back, clearly turning the idea over in his mind. You are suggesting that I could receive one of these markings myself. I'm saying if you want to really understand what it means to us, that might be the only way to actually get it, Daniel said. You can read about something 100 times, Doc, but until you carry it yourself, it's still just information. That's kind of the whole point of what we do. For a long moment, Ilven said nothing, staring down at his own hands, turning them over as if imagining ink beneath his own grey-toned skin. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty Daniel had not heard from him before. I would like to try, if it is safe. If you are willing to guide me. Daniel smiled, genuinely pleased by the request. I'd be honored, actually, but it should mean something, not just a random design. What would you want it to represent? Ilven thought carefully before answering. Understanding, he said. The moment I almost made a mistake based on fear of the unknown and instead learned something important about another species. A reminder to pause before assuming danger where there may simply be difference. That's a good reason, Daniel said. Maybe the best one I've heard. Perhaps we could combine something, Ilven suggested, growing more animated now. A symbol from your culture and one from mine. Something that represents both perspectives meeting in the same place. Like an anchor, Daniel said, glancing down at his own arm, paired with something from your side. Do you have a symbol for understanding or connection? Ilven nodded slowly. Yes, a spiraling glyph, often used in our oldest records to represent two ideas becoming one. It is considered a mark of unity. Then that's your design, Daniel said. An anchor for steadiness, holding it in place, and your glyph wrapped around it, showing the moment two different ways of thinking came together and understood each other. Ilven looked down at his own forearm. imagining the design Daniel had just described, and for the first time since Daniel had met him, something like genuine excitement flickered across the doctor's usually composed features. "When could this be done?" Ilven asked. Daniel grinned. "Give me a day to put together the equipment properly. I want to do this right. This isn't just ink, Doc. This is going to be the first Solari tattoo in history. Might as well make it a good one." Ilven nodded, and for the first time since the containment field had risen around Daniel less than 2 days earlier, something in the room felt entirely different. Not fear, not caution, just quiet anticipation for what neither of them had ever done before. News of the request did not stay quiet for long. By the following morning, half the ship had heard that Dr. Ilven intended to receive a tattoo, and reactions among the Solari crew ranged from fascination to open disbelief that their most careful, protocol-driven physician would willingly do something his own species had never attempted. The medical bay had never seen so many visitors at once, and certainly never for a procedure that had nothing to do with illness or injury. Daniel had spent the better part of the previous day rigging together a proper setup, borrowing a fine-tipped precision tool from engineering and adjusting it carefully under Ilven's supervision to make sure it would be safe for Solari tissue. Reeve had insisted on helping too, mostly by standing nearby offering unhelpful commentary and keeping the small crowd of curious onlookers from pressing too close. "All right, Doc," Daniel said, snapping on a pair of clean gloves. "Last chance to back out. Once we start, there's no changing your mind halfway through." Ilven, seated in the same chair Daniel had occupied 2 days earlier during his own scan, rolled up his sleeve and extended his forearm without hesitation. "I have made my decision. Please proceed." Captain Bellum stood near the doorway, arms crossed, watching with an expression somewhere between amusement and quiet pride. Beside her, Talais Van observed with his usual sharp focus, though the skepticism that had colored his face days earlier had softened considerably. "I still find this unusual," Van admitted quietly to the captain, "but I confess, I understand it now in a way I did not before." "That's usually how it works," Bellum said, with a small smile. "Understanding rarely comes before the willingness to try something new." Daniel began the careful work of transferring the design onto Ilven's forearm, a simple stencil first, tracing the outline of the anchor intertwined with the spiraling Solari glyph for unity. Ilven watched with fascination as the temporary pattern took shape on his gray-toned skin, and when Daniel finally asked if he was ready, the doctor nodded firmly. "Small warning," Daniel said, powering on the tool. "This is going to feel strange for the first few seconds, might sting a little too, depending on how your nerve endings compare to ours. Let me know if it's too much." "I am prepared," Ilven said, and to his credit, he did not so much as flinch when the needle began its slow, careful work. The room fell into a focused quiet, broken only by the soft hum of the tool and the occasional murmur from the small crowd gathered near the doorway. Vesa, the young technician who had first approached Daniel about his own tattoo, watched with wide, fascinated eyes, occasionally whispering updates to those standing behind her who could not see clearly. An hour passed, then another, Daniel working with steady, practiced patience, despite this being unlike any tattoo he had ever given. Solari's skin, he discovered, held pigment differently than human skin, requiring careful adjustments in pressure and depth that he made slowly, checking constantly to ensure Ilven remained comfortable throughout. Finally, as the design neared completion, Daniel leaned back and set the tool aside, wiping a light sheen of concentration sweat from his brow. "All right, Doc, take a look." Ilven raised his forearm, turning it slowly to catch the light. The anchor sat solid and steady at the center, exactly as Daniel had drawn it, while the spiraling Solari glyph wrapped gracefully around it, the two symbols merging seamlessly into a single design that belonged to neither species alone, and somehow to both. For a long moment, Ilven said nothing, simply staring at the mark now permanently part of his own skin. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an emotion Daniel had not heard from him before, something between wonder and quiet gratitude. "It is remarkable," he said softly. "I understand now, this is not simply decoration. It is a choice to carry meaning forward, visibly, permanently, a reminder that will never fade from memory because it will never fade from sight. The small crowd gathered near the doorway broke into quiet applause, human hands clapping alongside the soft rhythmic tapping that served as the Solari equivalent. Reeve let out a loud whoop that echoed down the corridor, earning a mock stern look from Captain Bellum that could not quite hide her own smile. "Congratulations, Doc," Daniel said, carefully applying a protective covering over the fresh design. "You're officially part of a very old tradition now." "I could not have asked for a better first attempt," Ilvin said, still admiring the mark on his arm. "Though I suspect my colleagues back home will have a great many questions when they see this." "Tell them it's a symbol of understanding," Daniel said, "because that's exactly what it is." Captain Bellum stepped forward, addressing the small gathered crowd with the kind of quiet authority that came naturally to her after years of command. "I think what happened here over the past few days says something important about all of us. We came close to a serious misunderstanding, one built on nothing but unfamiliarity. But instead of staying afraid of what we didn't understand, we asked questions, we listened, and now look what came from it." Talais Van, standing near the edge of the group, allowed himself a small, genuine smile as he studied the design on Ilvin's arm. "Perhaps this is worth recording in our own archives after all, not carved in stone this time, carried in skin." As the crowd slowly dispersed, chatting excitedly about what they had just witnessed, Daniel began cleaning up his makeshift equipment, glancing occasionally at Ilvin, who remained seated, still examining his new tattoo with quiet fascination. "Thank you," Ilvin said finally, looking up at Daniel with something like genuine friendship in his expression. "2 days ago, I nearly caused you harm out of fear. Today, you have given me something I will carry for the rest of my life, something that reminds me to seek understanding before judgment." "That's a pretty good trade, if you ask me," Daniel said, offering a hand, which Ilvin shook firmly, having fully mastered the human gesture by now. Outside the medical bay, word continued to spread through the ship, and by the following week, 3 more Solari crew members had quietly approached Daniel, asking if he might consider giving them one as well. What had started as a terrifying misunderstanding, a doctor mistaking a decade-old memorial for a fatal infection, had become something neither species expected. The beginning of a tradition shared freely between 2 very different worlds, carried forward not in vaults or archives, but in skin, exactly where Daniel always believed memory belonged.